In the quiet winter of 1831, a chill rolled off the Hudson River and swept through the growing town of Ashbourne, New York. Merchants spoke of opportunity, factories rose against the horizon, and the air carried the smoke of furnaces that promised progress. Yet, behind the stately facade of one of the grandest mansions in the county, an unspeakable pattern of horror was unfolding. It was here, in the Croftwell estate, that 5 different brides would one by one lose their minds in the same room, under circumstances so eerily alike that whispers of curses and diabolical conspiracies began to echo through the town. The Croftwell Mansion stood on a hilltop overlooking the Hudson, a sprawling Georgian structure of red brick trimmed with imported stone. Its 39 rooms glistened with European furnishings, velvet draperies, and mirrors imported from Venice. At night, lamplight spilled out from tall windows like a beacon, a symbol of wealth and influence. The estate was the crown jewel of Jonathan Croftwell, an industrialist who had risen from humble beginnings in the docks of Albany to become one of the wealthiest men in New York's steel and shipping trades. To the people of Ashbourne, Jonathan was a figure of fascination. He was tall, sharply dressed, his black hair already streaked with premature silver that lent him an air of wisdom. He spoke with confidence, but more than that, he seemed to look directly into people, offering them a kind of unsettling charm that was impossible to ignore. Men respected him. Women were drawn to him. He was, to all appearances, the epitome of ambition rewarded. But behind this carefully crafted image lurked something darker. For within less than 3 decades, 5 women, all young, healthy, and celebrated for their vitality, would step into Croftwell's mansion as brides, only to emerge months later as broken figures, their minds consumed by terrors no physician could adequately explain. The first was Eleanor Pierce, the 19-year-old daughter of a respected magistrate. The wedding, held in the autumn of 1831, was the grandest the town had seen. Over 200 guests filled St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, and the Ashbourne Gazette described Eleanor as radiant, a blossom of youth united with the steady oak of Jonathan Croftwell. When she moved into the mansion, people whispered she had everything a woman could desire: wealth, status, and a devoted husband. At first, Eleanor seemed to flourish. She hosted dinner parties with grace, organized charitable events, and walked the gardens in long white gowns that became the subject of admiring gossip. But by the following spring, subtle changes began to disturb those closest to her. Servants noted how she lingered too long in the eastern master bedroom, the grand suite reserved for the lady of the house. The mirrors that lined the chamber, great gilded pieces imported from Europe, seemed to capture her attention. Instead of gazing at her own beauty, she began to speak softly to her reflection, pausing, tilting her head, as though listening to something only she could hear. At first it seemed harmless, perhaps even the playful fancy of a young bride. But within weeks, her behavior grew stranger. She began insisting that the house itself was alive, that the walls shifted when no one was looking, that whispers slipped through the wallpaper at night. A letter from her sister Charlotte, discovered decades later in a trunk of family belongings, recounts one disturbing visit. Eleanor turned mid-conversation toward the empty doorway, smiling as if greeted by an unseen guest. When I asked her who it was, she answered gently, "Why, the house, of course, it knows me now." By midsummer, Eleanor's decline could no longer be dismissed. She was often found at her vanity, brushing her hair for hours while staring not into her own eyes, but slightly to the side, as though regarding another presence in the glass. One evening, during a lavish dinner party attended by prominent New York merchants, Eleanor rose abruptly from the table and walked to a tall mirror that dominated the dining room wall. Before the horrified guests, she began to argue heatedly with her reflection, gesturing wildly, laughing in a shrill tone unfamiliar to all who knew her. "Why do you look so tired?" she demanded of the glass, waiting as though the image had spoken back. Jonathan attempted to lead her away, but she resisted, insisting she had not finished speaking. That night, according to the testimony of the housekeeper, Eleanor was discovered tearing strips of wallpaper from the master bedroom walls with her bare hands. When confronted, she smiled serenely and whispered, "There are secrets beneath. I must see them." The town physician, Dr. Andrew Callahan, was summoned. His examination found Eleanor physically healthy but suffering from what he called nervous derangement of a most peculiar nature. In his notes, he described her fixation on mirrors and her belief that reflections carried knowledge unknown to her conscious mind. His diagnosis echoed the medical fashions of the era hysteria, a condition often ascribed to women who displayed unexplainable behavior. Within months, Eleanor could no longer recognize her own family. She spoke only to the mirrors, which she insisted housed the true Croftwell wives who came before. By autumn of 1832, Jonathan had her committed to the New York State Lunatic Asylum, a place where society conveniently deposited its inconvenient women. She would remain there until her death, her sanity never restored. Eleanor's fate sent ripples of unease through Ashbourne's elite. Yet the community's sympathy fell not with her, but with Jonathan. To many, he was the tragic husband, burdened by a wife whose delicate mind had collapsed under the pressures of high society. Physicians, ministers, and neighbors alike comforted him with the belief that Eleanor's illness was a random misfortune, a cruel twist of fate. Few suspected that her madness was but the first act in a repeating pattern of terror. For in the years that followed, Jonathan Croftwell would marry again, and each time the bride would walk into the grand eastern bedroom of Croftwell Mansion, only to emerge months later as a broken echo of the woman she once was, and always the mirrors bore silent witness. By the early 1830s, New York was in the throes of transformation. The Hudson River became a highway of industry, carrying barges of coal, iron, and timber southward to Manhattan and beyond. The Erie Canal, completed just a few years earlier, had transformed sleepy river towns into booming centers of trade. Ashbourne, once a modest settlement of farmers and fishermen, was suddenly alive with clanging hammers. The smell of burning coal and the rising ambition of men who saw fortune in steel, shipping, and speculation. It was in this environment that the Croftwell name rose to prominence. Jonathan Croftwell, barely 30, embodied the new class of American magnates, men who had clawed their way upward through grit, calculation, and ruthlessness. Unlike the landed gentry who boasted ancestry stretching back to colonial times, Jonathan was not born into privilege. His father had been a barrel maker in Albany, his mother a midwife. But from a young age, Jonathan displayed a restless intelligence and an unyielding drive. By his early 20s, he had left the docks where he first found employment and turned to speculation in iron and shipping contracts. When others hesitated, Jonathan seized risk. He invested in furnaces along the river, purchased derelict warehouses, and secured contracts to provide steel rails for the expanding network of railroads creeping westward. His timing was perfect. America was hungry for iron, for steel, for expansion, and Croftwell was there to feed it. Within a decade, his name carried weight from Albany to Manhattan. He moved his base of operations upriver to Ashbourne, where the land was cheaper, the river deep enough for shipping, and the town eager to court wealthy patrons. By 1830, the Croftwell estate had become both his fortress and his stage. The mansion itself was the ultimate declaration of triumph. Rising 3 stories atop Beacon Hill, it loomed over the town like a silent sentinel. Its construction had taken nearly 5 years, with stone imported from quarries in Vermont and marble fixtures brought across the Atlantic from Italy. The interior spoke of both wealth and eccentricity, high ceilings covered with intricate plasterwork, grand staircases that curved like serpents, and mirrors, so many mirrors installed in nearly every major room. The Eastern Master Suite was the crown jewel of the house, spanning nearly the entire wing. It contained a bed carved from mahogany, walls covered in French wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes, and tall windows that flooded the room with moonlight at night. Yet, what visitors remembered most were the mirrors, a massive Venetian glass above the fireplace, a full-length standing mirror framed in silver, and an ornate vanity mirror said to have been commissioned from artisans in Paris. Guests whispered that no expense had been spared to create a chamber worthy of royalty. But as the years passed, the house began to take on a reputation that wealth alone could not polish away. Servants whispered of strange drafts in the hallways, of footsteps echoing where no one walked, of voices murmuring behind the walls. Some claimed the mansion itself had moods that it breathed with the wind, and that its mirrors reflected more than mere flesh and fabric. For ordinary folk who never set foot inside, the Croftwell Mansion became a symbol of something grand, yes, but also unsettling. As though the very bricks had been mortared with secrets, Jonathan seemed to thrive in this environment of half respect, half fear. His dinners drew the most prominent merchants, bankers, and politicians from the region. He had a gift for making men feel indebted to him, whether through loans, favors, or whispered knowledge of their private dealings. At such gatherings, his charm was legendary, a flicker of his steel-gray eyes, a gentle but firm grip of the hand, a compliment delivered at precisely the right moment. These were Jonathan's tools, as potent as the furnaces that roared in his factories. The town's matrons, meanwhile, spoke endlessly of his eligibility, though whispers of Eleanor Pierce's decline still lingered. Society quickly moved to paint her illness as unfortunate but unrelated to her husband. After all, the official reports attributed it to female nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied both medical convention and social convenience. It allowed Ashbourne to preserve its admiration for Croftwell while dismissing Eleanor as a tragic but isolated case. And so, when Jonathan began appearing again at social functions, polished, gracious, though carrying the air of dignified sorrow, he was welcomed with sympathy. Mothers once again encouraged their daughters to seek his favor. Rumors spread that he intended to remarry, though none could say when or to whom. For a man of his means, it seemed inevitable. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, something more disturbing was unfolding. The servants who remained in the mansion after Eleanor's removal noticed peculiar habits in their employer. Jonathan had begun spending long evenings in his study, poring over books not of commerce but of medicine, psychology, and what were then called nervous afflictions. Titles imported from Europe lined his shelves: treatises on phrenology, essays on mesmerism, and letters from physicians experimenting with new treatments for hysterical women. One footman later testified that he often carried sealed packages into the house, bottles and powders with labels in German or French, items not available in local apothecaries. Meister Croftwell said they were restoratives for his poor wife's condition, the servant recalled years later, but Miss Eleanor was already gone by then. The juxtaposition was striking. In public, Jonathan was the grieving widower, conducting business with unmatched vigor, offering donations to local churches, even sponsoring improvements to the town's schoolhouse. In private, however, he appeared consumed by questions of the mind, the body, and how one might bend them to the will of another. The mansion itself bore witness to this duality. Its grandeur dazzled guests, but its corridors seemed to absorb whispers. Its windows gleamed with light, but its mirrors reflected shadows. Some claimed the Eastern Suite, sealed after Eleanor's departure, emanated a heaviness that could be felt even from the hallway. The servants avoided it, insisting they heard faint scratching on the walls at night. To outsiders, the Croftwell story appeared to be one of progress, wealth, and resilience. Yet for those who worked within its walls, it was becoming clear that the house was less a home and more a stage for experiments whose nature they could not yet comprehend. By 1834, Jonathan Croftwell would indeed remarry. And when the new bride crossed the threshold of the mansion, the whispers that had begun with Eleanor would soon return, louder, sharper, and far more difficult to dismiss, for the eastern bedroom seemed hungry, as though it demanded another occupant to continue its cycle of decay. The prosperity of Ashbourne might have masked the first tragedy, but with each new marriage, it would grow harder to believe in coincidence. The town was about to learn that the grandeur of progress often concealed horrors that no one dared name. Jonathan Croftwell's name became synonymous with fortune, refinement, and power. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, those who looked more closely sensed something unsettling, a hunger, perhaps, that extended beyond wealth or reputation. He had been born in Albany in 1801, the son of a barrel maker whose workshop smelled perpetually of pitch and sawdust. Jonathan's childhood, according to scraps of family testimony, was marked by discipline and silence. His father worked long hours, and his mother, though known for her skills as a midwife, died when Jonathan was just 12. He learned early that survival required calculation, not sentiment. The boy who once carried buckets of river water for his father's workshop became the man who would control contracts up and down the Hudson. By 25, Jonathan had already outmaneuvered competitors twice his age. He dressed better than most politicians, quoted Latin proverbs at dinner, and carried himself as though society owed him its deference. Physically, he was difficult to ignore. At over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair streaked prematurely with silver, Jonathan possessed a striking presence. His eyes, steel gray, almost colorless, gave the impression of cold depth. They unsettled rivals, but they also mesmerized those who longed for his approval. When Mr. Croftwell looked at you, one merchant's wife later recalled, you felt as though he were measuring not what you said, but what you concealed. This ability to unsettle while charming was one of Jonathan's greatest weapons. He rarely raised his voice. Instead, he listened intently, allowing silences to linger just long enough for others to reveal more than they intended. Businessmen left his study believing they had made a fair deal, only to realize later that they had surrendered advantages they hadn't even noticed. Socially, he played the role of the grieving widower with precision. After Eleanor's confinement, Jonathan never disparaged her. Instead, he spoke of her in mournful tones, shaking his head sadly at the mystery of the female mind. This restraint earned him sympathy and admiration. He was a man wronged by fate, yet determined to carry on with dignity. Mothers once again saw him as a match for their daughters. Society had a way of forgiving men when women were deemed fragile. But there was another side to Jonathan Croftwell, glimpsed only in fragments by those who lived under his roof. Servants noted his obsession with routine mirrors must be polished twice daily, candles extinguished at precise times, doors locked and relocked in peculiar sequences. One maid swore he measured the angles of the mirrors in the master suite, adjusting them by mere inches until the reflections aligned exactly as he wished. He collected books at an alarming rate, not only treatises on business, but medical volumes imported from Europe. Phrenology, mesmerism, early psychology, his library became a museum of obscure studies. One volume, bound in dark leather, contained notes on female hysteria and methods of managing it. Margins filled with Jonathan's own handwriting betrayed an interest that went far beyond curiosity. Induction of nervous instability, one scribble read, observed more readily in isolated environments. Visitors found his study unsettling. The room, located on the mansion's second floor, was lit not by sunlight but by lamps even in the day. Its shelves were stacked with anatomical diagrams, glass vials, and notebooks bound with string. The smell of tinctures and chemicals lingered in the air. He kept detailed records not only of financial dealings, but of people, their habits, weaknesses, illnesses, debts. It was said that Jonathan could ruin a man not with threats, but with a few pages of notes drawn from private conversations overheard at his gatherings. The question that haunted some who served him was simple. Why did he need so much control? Wealth he had. Status he possessed. But it was not enough. Jonathan Croftwell seemed to crave mastery not only over fortunes and contracts, but over the minds and perceptions of those around him. He wanted to shape reality itself. When he returned to society after Eleanor's removal, it was with calculated timing. He appeared not too quickly, lest he be thought callous, and not too slowly, lest he be thought defeated. Within 3 years, he was once again the centerpiece of Ashbourne society, attending galas, sponsoring charitable events, and speaking on the future of American industry. People admired his resilience. Few dared to question how a man could emerge from such a tragedy with his charm sharpened rather than dulled. It was during these years that Jonathan began to speak privately about the necessity of remarriage. But his tone was peculiar. He described it not in terms of companionship or affection, but of compatibility. He would, in conversations overheard by colleagues, compare choosing a wife to selecting a business partner, one who must endure the strains of public life, manage a household, and above all, possess the fortitude to maintain composure under pressure, behind closed doors. However, his obsession with the master bedroom deepened. The eastern suite, which had stood locked after Eleanor's collapse, was suddenly reopened. Painters and craftsmen were brought in to redecorate. The wallpaper was replaced, the bed polished, and most notably a new collection of mirrors installed. The servants, uneasy, asked among themselves why a man without a wife would need the suite restored. But Jonathan offered no explanation, save that the house must be prepared. Whispers of his peculiar habits spread quietly through Ashbourne. Some said he was haunted, others that he was eccentric, but as invitations to his gatherings continued, the wealthy and ambitious dismissed the rumors as idle chatter from jealous rivals. After all, who would believe that a man of such prominence could harbor something darker than mere grief? The truth was far more unsettling. Jonathan Croftwell was already preparing for his next bride. And with her, the cycle of charm, luxury, and inevitable madness would begin anew. The story of Eleanor Pierce Croftwell began with such promise that few could have imagined the tragedy that would follow. In the autumn of 1831, Ashbourne prepared itself for what the local papers hailed as the wedding of the decade. Eleanor Pierce, the 19-year-old daughter of Magistrate Henry Pierce, was beloved for her grace and intelligence. Unlike many young women of her station, she was known not only for her beauty, but also for her lively wit. She had been educated in both French and Latin, an accomplishment rare among the town's daughters, and her letters displayed a sensitivity of thought that made her a favorite at salons and gatherings. Her union with Jonathan Croftwell seemed a match made in heaven. The ceremony at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church was attended by nearly 300 guests, with the pews overflowing and townsfolk lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the radiant bride. The Ashbourne Gazette described Eleanor as a blossom of youthful innocence twined about the steady oak of industrial ambition. From the very beginning, she appeared to take naturally to her new role. The mansion, with its grand staircases and lavish dining rooms, became a place of activity once more. Eleanor was a gracious hostess, organizing dinners for Jonathan's business associates and charitable teas for the wives of prominent men. She was admired for her warmth, her laughter ringing through the halls, her presence bringing a sense of life to the cold grandeur of Beacon Hill. But as winter thawed into spring, subtle changes began to creep into Eleanor's demeanor. At first, no one paid much attention. She was quieter, perhaps simply adjusting to the responsibilities of managing such a vast household. Yet those who knew her best noticed how her eyes often drifted toward the eastern master bedroom, as though it pulled at her. She spent long hours within it, even when there was no reason to be there, claiming she felt at home only in that chamber. The suite itself was a wonder. Tall windows offered sweeping views of the Hudson, while mirrors imported from Venice lined the walls and reflected sunlight into glittering fragments. But, for Eleanor, the mirrors seemed less a luxury than a compulsion. She began to linger before them for hours, brushing her hair while gazing not into her own eyes but just to the side, as if something or someone were there with her. Her sister. Charlotte Pierce wrote in a letter preserved by the family Eleanor has taken to speaking softly while she sits at her vanity, pausing as though listening to a reply. When I asked her to whom she spoke, she only smiled faintly and said, "To the one who knows me better than I know myself." At first, Jonathan dismissed it as harmless fancy, but the servants grew uneasy. The housekeeper reported that Eleanor often refused to sleep anywhere but the master suite, claiming that the rest of the house felt wrong. On several occasions, she was found standing before the tall fireplace mirror at midnight, whispering questions and tilting her head as though waiting for answers. By summer, her oddities had become impossible to ignore. Guests noted her distracted air, her habit of staring at reflective surfaces during conversation, and her sudden laughter at remarks no one else had heard. At a dinner party attended by merchants from New York City, Eleanor startled everyone by rising from her seat mid-course, walking to the dining room mirror, and beginning what seemed to be a heated debate with her own reflection. She kept asking why her reflection looked so tired. One guest recalled years later in his journal, but the unsettling part was how she would pause listening as though the glass truly spoke back to her. That night marked the beginning of her rapid decline. According to testimony from the house staff, Eleanor was found hours later tearing down strips of the French wallpaper with her bare hands. When confronted, she turned with a serene smile and explained, "The house hides things beneath its skin. I must see them. Doctor." Andrew Callahan, the town physician, was summoned. His notes describe a young woman of otherwise perfect health suffering from a peculiar form of nervous derangement, marked by fixation upon mirrors and reflective surfaces. He noted her insistence that these reflections were not her own, but others who watch from within the glass. Over the weeks that followed, Eleanor's condition worsened. She moved from mirror to mirror throughout the mansion, carrying on elaborate conversations with what she called the other Eleanors. When the servants attempted to cover the mirrors, she clawed at the coverings until her hands bled, demanding that the reflections be freed. On the evening of September 12, 1832, she gathered nearly every reflective surface in the house mirrors, polished silver trays, even bowls of water into the master bedroom. She arranged them in a circle and spent the night in what the housekeeper described as a council with her other selves. By morning, she no longer recognized her husband or family. Jonathan, faced with a wife whose behavior had become both alarming and socially ruinous, sought the advice of physicians in Albany and New York City. The consensus was grim. Eleanor should be committed to an asylum for her own safety. On a gray October morning, as autumn leaves scattered across the mansion grounds, Eleanor was led away in a closed carriage. Witnesses reported that she continued to call back toward the house, "I'll return soon, the others are waiting for me." She never returned. Eleanor Pierce Croftwell would spend the next 40 years confined within the walls of the New York State Lunatic Asylum, her mind forever fractured, her days filled with murmured conversations to mirrors that the orderlies tried, unsuccessfully, to remove from her sight. The tragedy shocked Ashbourne. Yet society quickly found a way to explain it. Physicians spoke of female fragility, of hysteria brought on by the pressures of wealth and responsibility. Ministers muttered about the dangers of pride. But most of all, people pitied Jonathan, who now stood as a widower in all but name. His promising young marriage cut short by forces no man could control. What no one dared suggest not yet was that Eleanor's fate was not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of a pattern. The eastern bedroom had claimed its first bride, and soon it would hunger for another. Eleanor's removal to the New York State Lunatic Asylum in the autumn of 1832 sent ripples through Ashbourne's social circles. For days, whispers traveled from the pews of St. Matthew's Church to the parlors of wealthy merchants' wives. It was not merely that a young bride had gone mad, that, tragically, was not unheard of in a century when mental illness was still poorly understood. What unsettled the community was the suddenness of Eleanor's decline and the strange, consistent details that accompanied it, her fixation on mirrors, her insistence that others lived within them, and her conviction that the mansion itself was watching her. Yet, despite the strangeness of her case, society quickly adopted a narrative that spared them the discomfort of deeper questions. Physicians called it hysteria, the fashionable diagnosis of the day. The female constitution, wrote one physician in the Gazette, is peculiarly delicate and susceptible to the pressures of rapid social elevation. The implication was clear. Eleanor's madness was not the fault of her husband, nor of the house, nor of anything supernatural. It was her nature, fragile, unstable, overwhelmed by the burdens of wealth and responsibility. For many, this explanation was convenient. It aligned with long-standing prejudices about women, and it absolved the community of responsibility for what had occurred. Neighbors could shake their heads with pity, cluck their tongues at the tragedy, and carry on with business as usual. Jonathan Croftwell, meanwhile, played his role to perfection. He did not rail against fate, nor withdraw entirely from public life. Instead, he appeared dignified, wounded but resilient. He attended church services with bowed head, contributed generously to charitable causes, and spoke of Eleanor only in gentle terms. "My poor wife," he would murmur, "was simply too delicate for this world." His grief, delivered with such composure, won him sympathy rather than suspicion. In the privacy of the mansion, however, a different reality unfolded. The Eastern Master Suite, where Eleanor had spent so many hours conversing with mirrors, was sealed. The windows shuttered, the furniture draped in white cloth. Servants were forbidden to enter, and those who lingered near the locked door swore they heard faint tapping sounds, as if fingernails scratched against the plaster. Jonathan himself moved to a smaller chamber on the third floor. But, far from abandoning the memory of his wife, he seemed to become obsessed with it. His study, filled with medical texts, treatises on insanity, manuals of phrenology, pamphlets on mesmerism. Packages arrived from Europe containing powders and tinctures labeled in German or French. One servant recalled seeing bottles marked with words she did not understand: belladonna, laudanum mercurius. When asked, Jonathan explained curtly that they were remedies for nervous conditions. His journals from this period, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment of the mansion, revealed a chilling progression of thought. In one entry dated December 1832, he wrote, "If Eleanor's affliction was madness, it must have a cause. If it has a cause, it can be repeated. And if repeated, perhaps it can be understood." What for the world appeared to be tragedy, for Jonathan became an experiment. Meanwhile, the broader community turned Eleanor's collapse into a cautionary tale. Ministers warned of the dangers of female vanity, pointing to her fixation on mirrors as proof of spiritual weakness. Mothers whispered to their daughters that too much reading, Too much imagination could unbalance the mind. In the parlors of Ashbourne, Eleanor became less a person and more a symbol, the delicate flower crushed beneath the weight of modern life. But there were those who remained unconvinced. A seamstress who had worked in the Croftwell household swore that Eleanor had confided strange fears to her, that the walls contained hollow spaces, that she heard footsteps when alone. Another servant insisted that she once caught sight of Jonathan standing silently in the hallway, watching Eleanor as she argued with her reflection, making no move to stop her, only taking notes in a small, leather-bound book. These accounts, dismissed at the time as gossip, would later acquire a more sinister weight. For 3 years after Eleanor's confinement, Jonathan lived as a widower in all but name. He continued to oversee his factories and shipping contracts, but he rarely attended social gatherings. The mansion became a quieter place, with only a skeleton staff. Nights were said to glow faintly from the windows of his study, where he worked by lamplight long after the town had gone to sleep. During these years, he became increasingly interested in the medical community. He corresponded with physicians in Philadelphia, Boston, and even London, posing questions about nervous disorders and experimental treatments. He donated funds to research institutions, cultivating a reputation as a man determined to understand the mysteries of the human mind. To the public, this seemed the act of a grieving husband searching for meaning. To those who knew him more closely, it felt like something else, an intellectual curiosity tinged with cold calculation. By 1833, Eleanor's death in the asylum was quietly announced. She had wasted away physically as her mind deteriorated, succumbing at just 21 years of age. The funeral, small and private, was attended only by close family. Her grave bore the simple inscription, "Beloved wife." At peace, the tragedy might have ended there, preserved in the town's memory as one more example of life's cruelty. But for Jonathan Croftwell, it was not an ending. It was, in a sense, a beginning. He began once more to attend social events, this time with a new intensity in his gaze. He spoke of marriage not with the tenderness of a man seeking love, but with the measured tone of a man selecting a candidate for some great undertaking. A wife, he told one associate, must be chosen as carefully as a business partner. The Eastern Master Suite was quietly reopened, redecorated, and most significantly outfitted with a fresh set of mirrors. Servants whispered their unease. Why restore a room so steeped in tragedy? Why polish glass that had once reflected madness? Jonathan offered no answer, save that the house must be prepared. When at last he announced his engagement to a young woman named Isabella Morton, society once again celebrated. The tragedy of Eleanor was already receding into the past, replaced by the anticipation of a new beginning. But those who remembered the shadows cast by the first bride could not help but wonder, was this truly a fresh start? Or the opening of another chapter in a pattern too deliberate to ignore? The mansion on Beacon Hill, with its sealed passages and restless mirrors, seemed to hold its breath. Another bride was coming, and the house would be waiting. By the spring of 1834, the eastern wing of the Croftwell Mansion once again opened its tall windows to sunlight. Draped curtains were lifted, furniture uncovered, and the mirrors, those cold Venetian panels that had borne silent witness to Eleanor's unraveling, were polished until they gleamed like new. The townsfolk noticed, though no one dared speak it aloud. Many wondered why Jonathan would reoccupy the very chamber that had seemed to consume his first wife. The answer came in June, when the Ashbourne Gazette announced with celebratory flourish the marriage of Jonathan Croftwell to Isabella Morton, the 20-year-old daughter of a shipping magnate from New Haven. Isabella was everything Eleanor had been and more. Lively, confident, quick-witted, she charmed the town with her energy. Those who met her remarked that she possessed a constitution of iron, as though fate itself had chosen her to restore honor to the Croftwell name. For a time, it seemed the curse had been lifted. Isabella hosted gatherings that dazzled the town's elite. The mansion's halls rang with music and laughter, and merchants whispered that Jonathan had regained not only a wife but also his former brilliance in business. To casual observers, it was a golden season. But by the first frost of winter, shadows began to creep into Isabella's life. The servants whispered that she too had taken a peculiar interest in the Eastern master suite. She spent long evenings alone, her laughter ringing strangely through the halls as she spoke to friends unseen. The housekeeper once found her seated before the great fireplace mirror, scribbling notes on scraps of paper and nodding as though receiving instructions. Her decline was slower than Eleanor's, but unmistakable. By spring of 1835, Isabella had developed what she called conferences with her reflection. When pressed, she explained with serene conviction that the glass revealed secrets of the house. "The mirrors remember," she told her maid. "They show me things that happened long before I was born." Jonathan responded with a peculiar calm. Rather than express alarm, he began keeping a ledger in which he recorded Isabella's conversations with the mirror's times of day. Duration. The content of her mutterings. It was as though he viewed her decline not as tragedy, but as data. The breaking point came when Isabella insisted that the eastern bedroom walls contained hollow spaces. She began tapping at the plaster, listening for echoes, convinced there were passages hidden within. In May of 1835, she vanished from the dining room mid-meal and was discovered hours later crawling behind a wardrobe, her fingernails bleeding as she clawed at the wood. When restrained, she wept and cried. "She's inside, Eleanor's inside, begging me to dig her out." Within weeks, Isabella was committed to an asylum in Philadelphia, where she lived out her remaining years in fits of agitation and silence. Once again, the town murmured its sympathy for Jonathan, whose second bride had succumbed to the same inexplicable fate as his first. Doctors, citing nervous constitution, spoke of hereditary fragility, insisting there was no connection between the two tragedies. Yet, the servants knew better. Too many details overlapped the fixation on mirrors, the whispered conversations, the insistence on hidden spaces. Coincidence seemed increasingly impossible. Still, Jonathan pressed on. Barely a year after Isabella's removal, he announced his third marriage, this time to Caroline Whitford. The educated daughter of a Massachusetts clergyman, Caroline was known for her intellect, having published essays in local journals on literature and morality. Her marriage to Croftwell shocked some, for she seemed of a temperament too serious to be swayed by wealth or status. Yet, friends whispered that she had been charmed by his intensity, his vision of building a dynasty along the Hudson. Caroline's entry into the mansion marked a turning point. Unlike her predecessors, she kept a journal. At first, her entries brimmed with admiration for her husband and fascination with the grandeur of her new home. But by the autumn of 1836, the tone shifted. "The mirrors unnerve me." One passage reads, "At times, I feel they do not reflect me truly, but another someone waiting, watching." Another entry from December, Jonathan speaks often of Eleanor and Isabella. Though in terms too clinical for comfort, he studies their afflictions as one might study an experiment. I fear his interest lies not in their healing but in the repetition of their decline. Caroline's writings also describe unexplained phenomena within the mansion, footsteps in empty corridors, drafts where no windows were open, whispers behind the walls. Most disturbingly, she recorded her discovery of a small aperture concealed behind the wainscoting of the eastern suite, an aperture that allowed someone hidden in the wall to observe the chamber unseen. The diary suggests that Caroline grew increasingly suspicious of Jonathan himself. She described episodes in which he insisted she take remedies for headaches, bitter powders mixed into her tea. Afterward, she felt disoriented, her vision blurred, and the mirrors seemed alive with shifting images. "I believe the medicine makes me dream while waking," she wrote, and Jonathan insists I continue it, claiming it strengthens the nerves. By early 1837, Caroline's entries dissolved into incoherent scratches, half-formed words, and repeated references to the watchers in the glass. In March, she was removed to the asylum in Utica, where she remained until her death a decade later. Her journal was hidden by a sympathetic maid who smuggled it from the house, and only decades later did its pages confirm what many had long suspected: Eleanor and Isabella's declines had not been isolated tragedies. Jonathan Croftwell had now buried or institutionalized 3 wives, each following the same path into madness. Yet, still, society clung to its explanations. Women, after all, were fragile, and the pressures of wealth could unbalance even the strongest constitution. It was easier to believe in coincidence than to suspect deliberate cruelty. But beneath the surface, the pattern had become undeniable. The Eastern Suite had claimed 3 brides in less than a decade, and whispers spread that Jonathan was preparing once more that the chamber would soon receive its 4th. The mirrors, ever polished, gleamed in anticipation. By 1839, the whispers around Ashbourne had grown too loud to ignore. 3 wives gone mad within less than a decade, each collapsing in the same chamber of the Croftwell Mansion, was too uncanny to pass as coincidence. Yet Jonathan Croftwell, undeterred, prepared once more for marriage. His 4th bride was Lucia Belanti, the 23-year-old daughter of an Italian merchant whose shipping ventures connected New York to the Mediterranean. Lucia was unlike her predecessors in several ways. She had grown up in Naples before her family emigrated, and she carried with her not only a cosmopolitan education, but also a temperament sharpened by hardship. Her dark eyes betrayed quick intelligence, and her reputation for stubborn resolve preceded her. Those who met her after her engagement were struck by her clarity of mind. She was no naive girl to be swept along by wealth and charm. She was deliberate, sharp-tongued when necessary, and fiercely observant. When she moved into the Croftwell Mansion in late 1839, servants whispered among themselves that perhaps she, at last, might withstand whatever force seemed to consume her predecessors. At first, their hopes seemed justified. Lucia brought a liveliness to the house not seen in years. She spoke fluent Italian and French, introduced new music into the drawing room, and filled the dining hall with her laughter. Even Jonathan appeared more animated in her presence, as though invigorated by her resilience. For the house itself was patient. Within months, Lucia began to notice things. Unlike Eleanor or Isabella, she did not drift slowly into strange fancies. Instead, she documented her suspicions with precision. In letters later discovered among her family's papers, she described unusual drafts that seemed to emanate from behind the walls, and hollow sounds when she tapped at certain panels in the Eastern Suite. Servants assured her the mansion was old, its quirks natural, but Lucia was not convinced. One night, in January 1840, as snow lashed against the windows, she awoke to the faint sound of breathing steady, measured, though Jonathan lay asleep beside her. Rising, she pressed her ear to the wall. The sound grew clearer, as though someone were standing just beyond, separated only by a thin partition of wood and plaster. When she rapped the wall, the breathing ceased. Lucia's suspicion deepened when she noticed Jonathan's peculiar attentiveness to her health. He pressed powders into her hand whenever she complained of headaches, powders bitter in taste and strange in effect. After swallowing them, she described sensations of unreality, as though the room swayed gently like a ship at sea. Reflections in the mirrors seemed to ripple, faces shifting at the edge of her vision. Unlike Eleanor, she did not interpret these immediately as supernatural. Instead, she wondered whether she was being deliberately drugged. Her sharpness made her dangerous. Rather than succumb quietly, she began a secret investigation. With the help of a young chambermaid named Anna, she explored the mansion's forgotten corners. Behind an old wardrobe in the eastern suite, they discovered what appeared to be a concealed panel. After prying it loose, they revealed a narrow passage barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust. Carrying a lamp, Lucia crept inside and found that the passage extended the length of the eastern wing, punctuated by small apertures, tiny holes bored at angles that provided direct views into the bedrooms. The Watchers, Eleanor had once muttered in her asylum delirium. Now Lucia understood what she had meant. The mirrors were not magical, they were strategic. Positioned opposite the hidden apertures, they disguised the presence of observers. A man concealed in the walls could study the occupants of the suite without detection, using the mirrors to shield his gaze. When she confronted Jonathan, she did so indirectly. Over dinner, she remarked on the draft in the eastern suite, on the peculiar angles of the mirrors. Jonathan smiled faintly, but offered no answer. That night, she found her tea sweetened with honey to mask the bitterness of the powder he insisted she take. Her resistance grew more pronounced. She began refusing the medicines, feigning compliance but discarding them when Jonathan was not looking. Her mind, spared from the distortions, grew sharper. She recorded everything, the dates and times of Jonathan's instructions, the moments she heard movement in the passages, the expressions he wore when she mentioned the mirrors. Yet the strain was immense. For weeks, she played a dangerous game pretending to yield while secretly observing. Servants noticed her fatigue, the circles beneath her eyes, the way she startled at sudden noises. But unlike the others, she never surrendered fully to the delusion. One night in March 1840, Lucia made her boldest move. Gathering the household staff in secret, she led them into the passage she had discovered. By lamplight, they followed the narrow corridor until it emerged in a concealed chamber between the walls. Inside were small stools, ledgers, and a collection of bottles. The ledgers contained notes in Jonathan's handwriting, records of conversations overheard through the apertures, details of guests' indiscretions, and sketches of the women's behaviors. The bottles contained tinctures labeled in Latin belladonna, hyoscyamus, laudanum compounds known to induce hallucinations. "This is no curse," Lucia whispered to the servants. "This is a prison, and he is the jailer." But Jonathan was not a man easily outmaneuvered. Whether tipped off by loyal staff or suspicious of her absences, he confronted her days later. In her diary, the final coherent entry reads, "Tonight he told me the house itself would silence me if I could not be silent myself." His smile was calm. "I fear what comes." By summer of 1840, Lucia, too, was gone, committed to an asylum in New York City, her mind described by physicians as fractured by delusions of persecution. Jonathan provided generous funding for her care, further cementing his image as a devoted but cursed husband. Yet, unlike the others, Lucia had left behind evidence. Her letters, her diary, and the testimony of servants who had accompanied her into the hidden passages would later become crucial. At the time, however, they were silenced, dismissed as gossip, or discarded as exaggeration. The official narrative endured another fragile wife, undone by her own nerves. The eastern suite stood once more prepared, its mirrors polished, its walls concealing the secrets that had claimed 4 lives. And still, Jonathan Croftwell was not finished. By 1843, Ashbourne society was divided between awe and unease whenever the name Jonathan Croftwell was mentioned. 4 wives had already vanished into madness, each bride fading within months of her wedding. Yet, astonishingly, Jonathan remained one of the most eligible men in the Hudson Valley. His wealth had only grown, his factories booming with the demand for steel rails as the railroads expanded westward. The shadow of misfortune seemed not to tarnish him but to deepen his mystique. It was in that climate that his fifth marriage was announced, this time to Mary Ann Caldwell, the 19-year-old daughter of a respected banker from Albany. Mary Ann was young, vivacious, and impressionable, but also deeply curious, where her predecessors had been cautious or sophisticated. Mary Ann brimmed with restless energy. She devoured novels, asked endless questions, and carried a fascination for mysteries. Her friends often teased that she had a detective's heart in a maiden's body. The wedding was subdued compared to Jonathan's earlier ceremonies, perhaps out of respect for the tragedies that had come before. Still, hundreds attended, whispering behind lace fans about whether this new bride would fare better than the others. Some pitied her. Others envied her fortune. Many simply waited, their eyes drawn to the eastern windows of the Croftwell Mansion, where history seemed destined to repeat itself. At first, Mary Ann embraced her new life. She delighted in the grandeur of the house, gave tours of the gardens, and filled the halls with music from the pianoforte her father had gifted her. She spoke warmly of Jonathan, praising his intelligence and gravity, but soon she too began to feel the mansion's oppressive weight. Unlike Eleanor or Isabella, however, Mary Ann did not slide passively into the strange atmosphere of the Eastern suite. Instead, she questioned it. She noticed the drafts in the hallways, the hollow echo of footsteps when none were present. She observed Jonathan's peculiar interest in her health, his insistence that she take powders for her delicate nerves. She complied at first, but soon began discarding the bitter medicine in secret, curious to see what would happen. Her choice proved fateful, without the fog of the drugs clouding her perception. Mary Ann retained her clarity longer than the others, and with that clarity came discovery. While exploring the mansion's upper library one winter afternoon, she stumbled across a bundle of papers hidden in a locked drawer. The key, left carelessly in Jonathan's desk, gave her access to a collection of letters bound in twine. They were written in a mixture of English and German, signed by a certain doctor, Heinrich Zimmermann of Hamburg. Their contents chilled her blood. The letters detailed experiments conducted on women labeled as hysterical or unstable. They described precise dosages of mercury salts, belladonna extracts, and laudanum compounds intended to produce hallucinations, paranoia, and dissociation, all while leaving the body outwardly healthy. Zimmermann praised Jonathan's dedication to advancing medical science and urged him to continue documenting the reactions of his subjects. One passage stood out with a cruel clarity: the female mind, once destabilized by suggestion and chemical influence, is easily molded. Mirrors provide an excellent instrument for reinforcing delusion, as the subject perceives validation from her own reflection. Mary Ann realized with horror that the tragedies of Eleanor, Isabella, Caroline, and Lucia had not been accidents of fragile constitutions. They had been deliberate manipulations, orchestrated under the guise of medicine. Terrified, she confided in her maid, Abigail, who urged her to keep silent. "He's too powerful," Abigail warned. "No one will believe you." But Mary Ann's curiosity, once ignited, could not be quenched. She began searching the mansion for more evidence, convinced that the walls themselves concealed Jonathan's secrets. In the spring of 1844, she discovered a small hidden compartment behind the eastern bedroom's fireplace. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, filled with Jonathan's meticulous handwriting. It contained records of every wife dates of medicine dosages, observed behaviors, conversations overheard through the hidden passages. Each woman's decline had been charted like an experiment, their suffering reduced to data points. Most chilling was the final entry: Left incomplete, Subject 5 demonstrates heightened resilience. Reduced compliance with regimen. Observation required. Adjust dosage. The ink trailed off, as if Jonathan had been interrupted mid-sentence. Mary Ann confronted him one evening, her hands trembling as she held the ledger. "What is this?" she demanded. Jonathan regarded her calmly, his gray eyes unblinking. "You misunderstand," he said softly. "These were treatments. I sought only to cure them." But Mary Ann saw the lie. "You poisoned them," she whispered. "You turned their minds into cages. And now you mean to do the same to me." Jonathan's expression hardened. "You must understand," he replied. "Sacrifice is necessary for discovery. Weakness must be studied, controlled. The world will thank me one day." That night, Mary Ann fled to her chambers. Clutching the ledger and Zimmerman's letters, she wrote frantically to her father in Albany, describing what she had found. But the letter never reached him. Servants later testified that Jonathan intercepted her correspondence, burning her words in the fireplace. Within weeks, Mary Ann's behavior began to mirror the other's sleepless nights. Hours before the vanity mirror, whispered conversations with her reflection. Yet, unlike the others, fragments of clarity broke through. She confided in Abigail that she could feel the poison seeping through my veins, but insisted she would resist. "If I lose my mind," she told her maid, "remember that I was not mad, I was silenced." By summer of 1844, Mary Ann was declared unfit and committed to the asylum in Utica. There, she lingered for only a short time before her health declined fatally. Official records listed her cause of death as complications from nervous collapse, but hidden among her belongings was a torn page from Jonathan's ledger, smuggled out by Abigail. On it, in Jonathan's hand, were the words, "The mind bends. The house assists. Mirrors confirm. The subject believes." For the first time, there existed tangible proof of Jonathan's conspiracy. But in that moment, it lay dormant, a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. The Croftwell Mansion, now a place of whispered dread, had claimed its fifth bride. Yet the evidence Mary Ann uncovered would not remain hidden forever. In time, it would surface, and when it did, the house's carefully maintained facade would begin to crumble. By the winter of 1844, the Croftwell Mansion had become a fortress of whispers. Mary Ann Caldwell, Jonathan's fifth bride, had vanished into confinement, much like the wives before her. But unlike Eleanor, Isabella, Caroline, and Lucia, she had left fragments of truth behind letters never sent, a ledger half hidden, and words spoken to loyal servants who dared remember. Rumors began to reach her father in Albany, banker Thomas Caldwell, a man not easily cowed by reputation or wealth. For months, he had heard unsettling reports of his daughter's decline, her sudden obsession with mirrors, her desperate warnings about poison, her letters intercepted. When word arrived that she had been quietly placed in the Utica asylum, Thomas refused to accept the official explanation. He traveled to Ashbourne unannounced, determined to confront the man who had stolen his daughter's sanity. The confrontation took place in the Croftwell Library, a dark-paneled room lined with medical texts and ledgers, lit by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the shelves. Jonathan greeted Caldwell with practiced calm, his steel-gray eyes unflinching. "Your daughter," he said gravely, "was afflicted with the same unfortunate malady that claimed my previous wives. I have spared no expense in ensuring her comfort." But Caldwell was no naive parent to be placated. He had come armed with fragments of Mary Ann's writings, smuggled to him by Abigail, the maid descriptions of hidden passages, bottles of bitter powders, and letters from a German physician named Zimmermann. Placing them on the table, he demanded an explanation. For the first time, Jonathan's composure wavered. He glanced at the papers, then back at Caldwell, calculating. "These are the ravings of a troubled mind," he said smoothly. "Do not mistake delusion for truth." It was at that moment that a second voice entered the conversation. Abigail herself, trembling but resolute, stepped from the doorway. She had risked her livelihood, perhaps even her life, to speak. "It is not delusion," she declared. "I've seen the powders. I've seen him measure them, slip them into her tea. I've heard the footsteps in the walls." Caldwell pressed harder. "Show me," he demanded of Abigail. "If there are passages, if there is proof, take me there." Reluctantly, Abigail led them both up the grand staircase, down the corridor toward the eastern suite, the chamber where 5 women had lost themselves. Jonathan followed, silent, his expression unreadable. Inside, the air was heavy, the mirrors glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Abigail moved to the great wardrobe against the far wall and pressed her hand against the paneling. With a soft groan of wood, a section of wall gave way, revealing the narrow aperture that Lucia had once discovered. The passage yawned open, stale air rushing out like the breath of something long buried. Caldwell held the lamp high, his jaw tight as he peered inside. The corridor extended into darkness, lined with small holes that offered views into the bedroom. The evidence was undeniable. This was no trick of the imagination. Someone had been watching. Jonathan spoke at last, his voice low and steady. "Do you imagine you've uncovered a crime? This house was built with secrets long before I owned it. I merely used what was already here. Observation. Mr. Caldwell is not a sin. It is survival. But deeper within the passage lay proof that went far beyond observation. In a concealed chamber, they found ledgers bound in Jonathan's handwriting, meticulous notes on each wife's decline, dosage schedules of substances administered, and accounts of their behaviors as though they were experimental subjects. Bottles still half full lined the shelves, their labels bearing names of poisons and hallucinogens. One entry, dated only months before Mary Ann's collapse, read Subject 5 resists initial conditioning. Increased dosage required. Mirrors remain effective stimulus. Must refine methods. Caldwell's hands shook as he read. "You poisoned them," he whispered. "Every one of them." Jonathan, remarkably, did not deny it. Instead, he straightened, his voice rising with eerie conviction. "I studied them. Do you not see the mind is the final frontier of science? Those women, your daughter included, were delicate vessels through which I could glimpse truths no physician yet dares seek. Weakness is the key, Mr. Caldwell. The fragile reveal what the strong conceal." His words dripped with fanatic certainty. But Caldwell heard only the confession of a man consumed by his own cruelty. Turning to Abigail, he ordered her to fetch the magistrate at once. But Jonathan moved swiftly, seizing the ledger from the table and hurling it into the fire. Flames licked at the pages, curling them into ash. Yet it was too late. Abigail had preserved fragments, and Caldwell had seen enough. The truth could not be fully destroyed. The confrontation spiraled into chaos. Servants, awakened by raised voices, crowded the hallway. Some confessed what they had long suspected, that their master dosed his wives, that the house was not cursed but engineered. Others, terrified of reprisal, remained silent. But the weight of testimony began to tip the scales. By dawn, word had spread through Ashbourne that the great Croftwell Mansion contained hidden chambers and poisons. The community that once pitied Jonathan now looked at him with suspicion. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter, whispering of the bridegroom of madness who turned wives into lunatics. The walls of the mansion had kept their secrets for more than a decade. But with Mary Ann's courage and Caldwell's resolve, those secrets were beginning to spill into the open. Jonathan Croftwell, once admired as a man of ambition and refinement, now stood on the brink of exposure, and the mirrors always polished, always watching reflected the final act of his carefully constructed empire of silence. The revelations of 1844 did not stay hidden within the walls of the Croftwell Mansion. By the following spring, what had begun as whispers in Ashbourne erupted into one of the greatest scandals in New York's early industrial era. Thomas Caldwell wasted no time, armed with the fragments of Mary Ann's diary, the testimony of Abigail, and his own observations of the hidden passages and poison bottles. He petitioned the county magistrate for a full inquiry. At first, there was reluctance. Jonathan Croftwell was wealthy, influential, and known for his generosity to public institutions. But Caldwell was relentless, calling upon his banking connections in Albany and New York City. Within weeks, investigators arrived at Beacon Hill with warrants. What they found silenced even the skeptics. The hidden corridors were undeniable, behind walls that had seemed solid. Carpenters revealed narrow walkways, observation ports drilled into plaster, and chambers outfitted with stools and ledgers. More disturbing still were the caches of powders and tinctures, some labeled, others unmarked. Physicians consulted during the inquiry confirmed the presence of belladonna, laudanum, and mercury compound substances known to cause delirium, hallucination, and eventual breakdown of the nervous system. The ledgers, though some had been burned, yielded enough to establish a pattern. They contained precise notations of dosages, hours of mirror fixation, and behavioral responses. One entry described Eleanor muttering to her reflection for 2 continuous hours after ingestion positive reinforcement achieved. Another listed Lucia's discovery of the passages as a setback, followed by instructions to increase the strength of her tea. Public outrage was immediate. The image of Croftwell as a tragic widower crumbled overnight. Newspapers seized on the story, printing lurid headlines: Ashbourne bridegroom a monster, the House of 5 mad wives, and Science or Sin, the Croftwell experiments. Citizens who once envied the mansion on Beacon Hill now crossed themselves when passing it, whispering that it was cursed by the blood of innocents. Jonathan was arrested in May of 1845. His trial, held in Albany, drew crowds so large that extra constables were summoned to maintain order. Witnesses included servants, physicians, and even builders who confirmed the existence of the passages. Abigail testified with trembling hands, recounting how she had seen Jonathan administer powders, how she had smuggled fragments of Mary Ann's letters, how she had heard the muffled cries of women locked in their chambers. Most damning of all were the letters from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, recovered from Jonathan's study. Their cold, clinical tone described precisely the methods by which women could be driven into madness under the guise of treatment. Prosecutors read them aloud in court, their words echoing like incantations of cruelty the feminine mind, when subjected to hallucinogens, will externalize delusions into reflective surfaces. Mirrors provide excellent medium for reinforcing instability. Jonathan's defense was chilling in its own way. He admitted freely to surveillance, insisting it was a tool of commerce, not crime. He confessed to administering medicines, but claimed that they were legitimate treatments prescribed by European physicians. "I sought only to understand," he told the jury, his voice steady, almost persuasive. "If my methods were harsh, it was for the advancement of science." But his composure broke when Mary Ann herself was brought forth. Against all odds, her father had secured her temporary release from the asylum once physicians confirmed she had recovered somewhat after being removed from Jonathan's influence. Pale, trembling, yet lucid, she testified that her visions had begun only after taking her husband's powders. She described the hidden passages, the voices behind the walls, and the moment she discovered the ledger that reduced her suffering to observational notes. "I was not mad," she declared, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. "I was poisoned. My reflection was not a delusion. It was the last part of myself struggling to survive." The jury required less than a day to deliver its verdict guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, conspiracy, and unlawful experimentation. Though the exact charge of poisoning remained difficult to prove under existing law, the overwhelming weight of evidence left no doubt. On July 2, 1845, Jonathan Croftwell was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution, carried out in the courtyard of Albany's jail, was attended by hundreds. Accounts describe him as calm to the end, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his eyes scanning the crowd with something between disdain and indifference. When asked for last words, he spoke only, "Weakness reveals truth. You will see." The trapdoor fell, and with it ended the life of a man who had once been the most admired figure in the Hudson Valley. But his death did not erase the shadows of the Croftwell Mansion. The house itself lingered as a symbol of dread. Sold at auction to cover debts, it passed through several owners, none of whom remained long. Tenants complained of drafts, footsteps, and the unnerving sensation of being watched. The eastern suite was eventually bricked over, its mirrors removed and destroyed. By the late 19th century, the once grand estate had fallen into disrepair and was torn down to make way for a boarding house for railroad workers. Yet, even after its demolition, locals claimed the hilltop remained cursed. The Croftwell trial left a lasting mark on American law and medicine. Legislators in New York passed reforms requiring independent review before a woman could be committed to an asylum, reducing the ease with which husbands could dispose of inconvenient wives. Medical journals, though slow to condemn, eventually acknowledged the dangers of untested treatments and the ease with which science could be twisted into cruelty. More importantly, the story of the Croftwell brides forced society to confront its own prejudices. For decades, women's testimonies had been dismissed as hysteria, their warnings ignored, their pain reduced to nervous weakness. But Eleanor's whispers, Isabella's notes, Caroline's diary, Lucia's discovery, and Mary Ann's courage formed a chorus too loud to silence. A century later, in 1945, a historical marker was placed near the site of the mansion. Its inscription read simply, "In memory of the women whose voices were silenced here." Their suffering revealed truths that changed the course of justice. Today, the story of Jonathan Croftwell remains one of the most chilling reminders of how ambition, cloaked in charm and wealth, can mask cruelty of the darkest kind. 5 brides entered the mansion on Beacon Hill with dreams of love and prosperity. All but one were consumed by its shadows, and though the house itself is gone, the legend endures that in the stillness of certain mirrors. One might yet glimpse their faces, waiting, watching, whispering warnings from the glass.